All right, so we're diving into a story today that you might think you already know, but trust me, there's a reason this case just hasn't faded away like some other big trials from the past. We're talking, of course, about the Menendez brothers.
A name that practically screams 90s sensationalism.
Exactly. And now, thanks to that new Netflix series everyone's talking about, it feels like they're back in the headlines.
Yeah, you can't escape it.
But before we all collectively roll our eyes and think, here we go again, another rehashed true crime documentary, I just want to say this deep dive is about so much more than that, you know? We're not just here to rehash the same old facts.
Right.
We're really using this new article from Time magazine, which, by the way, was just published today, to unpack what makes this story still feel relevant, even all these years later.
It's true. This case really gets under your skin.
For sure. So, for anyone who might not be familiar with the basics, here's the rundown. 1989, Beverly Hills, the Menendez parents are found murdered.
In their mansion, no less.
Exactly, which right away tells you this isn't your average crime story. But what really makes this case stand out is how it all unfolds, all the family secrets, the accusations, the courtroom drama. It really makes you confront some uncomfortable questions about justice, about abuse, even about how we as a society try to make sense of these really complicated stories where there are no easy answers.
And it's that last part, the way the public responded, that I find particularly interesting. Because this wasn't just a family tragedy, this became a full-blown media sensation, playing out against this backdrop of, well, a rapidly changing media landscape. We're talking pre-internet, pre-social media.
So how did a case like this capture the public imagination in that era?
Well, for starters, the details of the crime itself. I mean, even for a place like Beverly Hills, what happened was unusual, disturbing even.
Right.
This wasn't some random act of violence. The level of, well, aggression involved. It was calculated, gruesome, and all of that together, immediately it suggested there was a much deeper story here.
It's like the second those details came out, everyone must have been thinking, okay, there's more to this than meets the eye.
Exactly. And that's something the Time article really digs into, that initial shock that rippled through the community and beyond. Because again, this wasn't just a crime.
Yeah.
It was this anomaly. You know, Beverly Hills has this image of safety, of serenity, wealthy enclave. So for something this brutal to happen there, it shattered that perception.
Yeah, it's like it violated this unspoken agreement about the social order, you know?
Yeah.
Suddenly, no one was safe, not even behind those gated walls.
Right. And you can imagine the pressure the police were under to find answers. And then on top of that, you've got the public completely captivated, everyone hungry for a narrative that could help make sense of something so senseless.
And for 6 months, the investigation just went in circles, theories everywhere, no real leads. Until, that is, the tip came in that blew the whole thing wide open.
And what a tip it was.
Because this wasn't like someone just called in a tip anonymously, you know? This was serious stuff.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't Crime Stoppers.
This tip came from the mistress of the brothers' psychologist,
Yeah.
who claimed that Erik, the younger brother, had actually confessed to her, or at least confessed to the psychologist when she was around.
I mean, talk about a bombshell. And this was, way before HECOPA was really a thing that people understood. So suddenly you have this massive ethical dilemma. Patient confidentiality, which is, the cornerstone of therapy, up against a potential double homicide.
It's like, where do you even begin to figure out what's ethical, what's legal, what's right in that situation?
Right. And that's just it. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But what makes this even more complicated is that the psychologist, he had actually recorded his sessions with Erik.
Wait, there are tapes.
Tapes, and not just any tapes. Allegedly, these tapes include Erik confessing to the murders.
Wow. So, I mean, you can imagine the legal battle over those tapes, right? I mean, that's like a lawyer's dream, but also a potential ethical nightmare.
Exactly. I mean, on the one hand, you have the sanctity of that therapist-patient relationship. The idea that you should be able to talk to your therapist, to anyone, really, about your mental health, and know that it's not going to be broadcast to the world.
Right, like that's the whole point of therapy, to have that safe space.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, you have potential evidence in a double homicide. So how do you weigh those two things against each other?
It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a movie, not real life.
Right. And to make matters even more intense, all of this is happening before the days of court TV.
Oh, man. Can you imagine?
It was this perfect storm. I mean, the details of the case were already salacious, right? Wealthy family, Beverly Hills, a brutal murder. But then you add in this element of mystery, the confession tapes, the question of whether or not they'd be admissible, and you've got the whole country glued to their TVs, waiting for the next development.
I mean, it practically invented the 24/7 news cycle as we know it, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The Time article calls it the dawn of the 24/7 news cycle, actually. It was a watershed moment for how we consume this kind of news. But before the defense really got into it, the prosecution laid out their case.
Which I have to imagine at the time seemed pretty straightforward.
Right. It was classic greed, if you will. According to the prosecution, the brothers saw their parents' wealth as their ticket to an even more extravagant lifestyle. Which, looking at their spending habits after the murders, it wasn't exactly a huge leap.
Right, it's not like they were trying to keep a low profile, were they? New cars, designer clothes, trips, it all seems pretty damning.
Yeah, and the prosecution really played that up. Spoiled rich kids, willing to kill for a bigger inheritance. And you have to remember, this was the 80s, so that image, it really resonated with a lot of people. It tapped into a lot of existing anxieties about class and privilege and excess.
Totally. So with what seems like, at least on the surface, a pretty clear motive, with all this public attention, how does the defense even begin to counter that narrative?
By flipping the script
Yeah.
completely. Because when the defense presented their case, they dropped a bombshell. Allegations of abuse. Years of abuse at the hands of both parents.
Whoa!
And it wasn't just physical abuse. They were alleging sexual abuse, too, by the father.
Wow. Okay, so this is suddenly a very different story. We've gone from cold-blooded murder to something much more complex, much more nuanced. I mean, this is huge. We're talking about the early 90s, right?
Yeah.
A time when talking about this kind of thing, sexual abuse, especially within a family, it was taboo.
Absolutely. And you have to understand that context. The stigma was enormous.
Yeah.
The Time article actually draws a parallel to the way we're still grappling with some of these same issues today.
Yeah.
Like how power dynamics and fear, they can silence victims.
Because who wants to come forward knowing that people might not believe them? Especially back then. It's like the odds were stacked against them from the start.
Exactly. And the first trial really highlighted how divided public opinion was on this whole thing.
Oh, right. Because it ended with a hung jury, didn't it?
It did.
So they had to go through that entire ordeal twice. Talk about adding insult to injury, to have to relive all of that trauma in front of a whole new group of strangers.
It's almost unimaginable. And the second trial was a very different experience. For one thing, cameras were banned, so there wasn't that same level of public scrutiny.
Which I guess is a double-edged sword, right? Less pressure, maybe, but also less transparency.
Right, exactly. And on top of that, the judge actually put limits on how much testimony could be presented about the abuse allegations, which, as the Times article points out, is something that's still being debated today.
Interesting. So less focus on the abuse, less public access. What does that mean for the final verdict?
Well, the second jury ultimately found the brothers guilty on all counts. But, and this is important, that's not where the story ends. Because even now, all these years later, new evidence has emerged that's casting doubt on that guilty verdict.
You're talking about the former Menudo member,
Yeah.
the one who came forward with accusations against Jose Menendez.
Exactly.
Which I have to say, that's huge. I mean, Menudo back then, they were everywhere. To accuse someone like that with that much power?
It takes an incredible amount of courage. And it potentially changes everything about this case. Because now you have this possible pattern of behavior. It lends a lot of credibility to the brothers' claims. Maybe they weren't making it up after all.
Wow. And then on top of that, there's that letter.
Right. The letter Erik wrote before the murders, which surfaced just recently.
The one where he details the abuse.
Exactly. And while it's not a smoking gun, so to speak, it does add another layer of complexity to an already complicated case.
So, I mean, the big question is, with this new evidence, could their convictions actually be overturned after all this time?
That's what their attorney is hoping for. They're petitioning for a new hearing based on this new evidence. Whether it'll be successful, that's still uncertain. But it raises some really big questions for all of us about how we define justice. Is it about punishment, or is there room for something else? For redemption, for acknowledging that sometimes things aren't so simple.
It's like that saying, right? Life is rarely black and white, mostly shades of gray.
Exactly. And in this case, it really throws that into sharp relief.
It makes you think about what we were talking about earlier, how we as society try to make sense of these stories, these real-life tragedies where there are no easy answers. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes the pursuit of justice, it just leads to more questions. But I think engaging with those questions, that's what matters. So As you revisit this case, I just encourage everyone listening to really think about what justice means and whether our legal system, as it stands, is truly equipped to handle the complexities of cases like this. Because if this deep dive has taught us anything, it's that sometimes the truth, it's a lot more complicated than any headline could ever capture.
Couldn't have said it better myself.